Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Ouyang, to talk about Donald Trump and his Twittering. Dr. Ouyang, thank you for joining me. You're an assistant professor of political science at Purdue University Northwest and the co-author of Trump, Twitter, and the American Democracy, Political Communication in the Digital Age. Tell me about why Twitter is important to the American presidency.
So thanks, Tom, for having me here. It's good to be on the show.
Yeah.
The motivation for this book project really came out of, it was a fun project for the two of us. So this is a book that's co-authored with Richard Waterman at the University of Kentucky. And the two of us are specialists in the U.S. presidency. So so among the questions that we're interested in is how have U.S. presidents exercised their various abilities and powers of the office to do the types of policies that they're interested in. And in the past, we've looked at executive actions such as executive orders, memoranda, proclamations. We've also explored how presidents exercise their appointment powers to put the people that they want in various federal agencies. And about a year or so ago, we were looking for a break, and it struck us that Twitter is very interesting to both of us, and it was a good time to pick up, something that we've looked at previously, and that is presidential communication. And this book project started as a conference paper where we simply took a very narrow snapshot of the various activities that Trump's Twitter account has happened. And we think that, the approach that we bring to the table adds to not just the sort of what journalists have shown us about what Trump does on his Twitter account, but by bringing a social science perspective to his activities on Twitter, we are better able to find out more about who Trump is and how he exercises the powers of the office.
Yeah, so this started out almost as an academic lark, if you will, right? And I assume that you found there was more substance to it as you went on. You mentioned how journalists covered this. We've all seen articles about Trump's tweets. How would you characterize how journalists view this and what you're bringing to the party that's in addition to that?
So in the opening chapter of our book, we sort of put the way that we looked at various journalist reportings, we kind of put them in various buckets. So there are media articles that focus on specific tweets and the controversies that those tweets generated. There are articles that focus on how often Trump tweets and perhaps the subject of those tweets. And there are even articles that tries to subscribe motivations for his activities and sort of the targets of his ire on Twitter.
Yeah.
But we see and we looked at the academics literature in this area as well, particularly those that focus on his Twitter activity. And we notice a glaring hole in the literature as academics.
But there is a body of literature on this, which is interesting to me, yes.
And the biggest hole that we saw was that both the journalists and the social scientists that have looked at this tends to have a very narrow focus. And what I mean by that is they tend to either focus on particular tweets or they focus on particular time frame. But we know that Trump's Twitter account has been active since 2009. Well, if the object is to understand who he is and what he does on Twitter, we think that if we don't expand our time frame to look at the entirety of his Twitter activities, then we're really missing the big picture of who he is, but also how he uses Twitter as a strategy.
And the who he is category is something that comes out of the tradition of writing biographies and articles about the presidency going back to early 20th century, I guess, right?
Right.
Is Twitter now important for the presidency, or is it just of interest right now because Trump is doing it?
I think it's both. So scholars who focus on what's called the rhetorical presidency.
Jeffrey Toulis.
Exactly.
Okay, very good.
Right, as you know, right,
Yeah.
he pointed to Theodore Roosevelt as sort of the start of
the first person.
as the first person who started all of this. And
So if I can interject here, so the viewers understand. So George Washington started a tradition of not talking publicly about policy, right? And that carried on, I think, until Andrew Johnson, because when he was being impeached, he was going to the public and stating his case, but he doesn't really count. And Teddy Roosevelt was the first one who wasn't getting what he wanted from Congress and started appealing directly to the public through speeches, using the bully pulpit, as he called it, right? And started a new tradition of presidents going to the people, basically, right?
And it makes sense that it started with Teddy, right? Because it was at that time, right, the rise of a national media really came into being. But but beyond Teddy, right, it was his cousin Franklin Roosevelt, right, where students today learn about how FDR uses his fireside chats to sort of connect and to communicate with the American public. And so each step that there was a technological advance, presidents exploit those new technologies in order to sort of not just better communicate their policy agenda to the public, but also to leverage it to influence other political actors.
So for Teddy Roosevelt, it was the newspapers, right? And for Franklin Roosevelt, it was the radio, right? Because those were radio broadcasts, as I recall, right? Yeah.
And modern presidency today, right? There was a really excellent quote by a presidential scholar named Mary Stuckey, where, and I'm paraphrasing the quote here, is that presidential leadership today means public leadership, right? There's while presidents earlier in this country's history may have the luxury of not needing to engage publicly with the American people, presidents today do not have that luxury, right? They have, by the virtue of our expectations, they have to engage with us.
Yeah, and you've raised a very interesting issue here, because I'm thinking about this. You know, Roosevelt with the newspapers, Franklin Roosevelt with radio, and then probably Nixon. Am I right? Because he buys time on television to give his checker speech to defend himself against the charges of his fund that he supposedly misspent, and then and really. The
social
next
media
big
is the
issue
next logical step,
is,
right?
is social media, and I know Obama took it to a new level, but Trump really has added a completely new wrinkle to this with tweeting, and it's not just that he's getting to people in a personal way, but he's able to do it spontaneously, which nobody was able to do before, right?
Yeah, and Obama definitely started the trend of presidents being on social media, but Obama was pretty tame by comparison. It was very late in his administration that Obama even had access to his personal Twitter account. Most of his prior activities actually came from White House staff.
I guess I'm thinking he did a lot of fundraising through online methods,
And social media is a fascinating tool for presidency scholars, because just like each of our social media accounts is a glimpse into our personal lives and what we happen to think about at that particular moment, Trump's Twitter account especially does that, right? It gives scholars and the American public a way to find out what's on their commander-in-chief's mind as he's thinking about them.
Now, an interesting question, I think, at this point is, how much thought is Trump giving these tweets? Is he being strategic, or is he being compulsive when he's doing this? If he's being strategic, then it's only telling us what he wants us to think, right? If he's being compulsive, which he seems to be in a lot of cases, then we are really getting some insights into what he's thinking about, right? Where do you think this falls?
So there's many of it. So at any point when we think about presidential communications, right? One thing that we must always keep in mind is that it's never just the president's voice. It's also the sort of the assistance that they get from the people that works in the White House. And we know that there are various personnel in the White House that helps presidents. Well, one person in particular, his name is Dan Scavino, and he is now one of the longest serving person working in the White House. And he is one of the major influence on Trump's Twitter, right? So we know that Trump tweets. We know that, and we have journalist accounts, and we also have data from our book that sort of supports that the very early morning tweets and the very late in the evening tweets are very likely to be Trump's. In fact, former White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus was quoted in Bob Woodward's first book about the Trump administration that Priebus referred to the presidential bedroom as the devil's workshop, and the sort of early mornings and late Sunday nights as the witching hour. And there was a systematic attempt to sort of control what Trump tweets about at any given moment.
Right.
And I have examples to talk about there, but we know that he is compulsive.
Yeah.
We know that Trump reacts, especially to what he sees on the news that particular night.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what we're able to find and show in the book is that there is a systematic / strategic component to his behavior. And what we mean by that is we know that he has certain tweets that generates a lot of reaction, especially negative reaction. So the question is, why does Trump go negative on Twitter, right? So the sort of...
Would you say that he tends to go negative more than anything else on Twitter, or just those just the things that show up in the news most often?
I would say those are just the ones that show up in the news most often. So there was a columnist whose name escapes me at the moment, but it was a couple of years back, and she made a point to say in her column that time that journalists tends to pay way too much attention to Trump, especially to specific actions. And that's part of our motivations for completing this project in the first place, because what we found was that when we look at the tone of Trump's tweet in the totality, he's neither positive nor negative, right? On balance, his Twitter account is fairly neutral. So the question becomes, why are there certain tweets that are especially negative? And among the results that we're able to show in the book is that, as you might suspect, it is the more negative tweets that generate the most reactions. And part of what journalists and academics have able to say about Trump at this point is that he is someone who really loves attention, and he's sought them out. And the way that, and theoretically, the way that we put everything together is when Trump desires attention, right? He's very careful about writing a very negative tweet. And we know that because, for instance, in his interviews with various personnel in government, in the Trump administration, Bob Woodward actually had this fascinating case where Trump would actually print out his tweets in really big size font, and would actually sit down with his staff and to talk about the reactions that particular tweet received, and how they might go about writing the next one. So we know there is a very strategic component to this.
I had no idea. That's fascinating. Well, let me ask you this. Who do you think is reading these? I know journalists are reading them, and so I know about them because I see stories about them. But who do you think is checking their phone every now and then to see what Trump's tweeting? What sorts of people are doing this?
So I think the people that we normally might think of, right? So the journalists, the academics like me who does research in this area. But it's really anyone who's interested about what the United States care about at any given moment. So as one of the...
So Russia, for instance, probably has somebody assigned to monitoring these tweets, right?
Definitely. So, for instance, in our opening chapter, one of the examples that we used to motivate the book was Trump's tweets about Syria. So one day, seemingly out of the blue, he tweeted that it was a success in Syria and that the United States was going to pull out its troops. It was an announcement that surprised everybody.
Do you think if he was president during World War II that he would have blabbed about D-Day and ruined the invasion?
I I think that is certainly the worry that many people have.
Oh my gosh.
And there are reasons to believe that foreign governments sees his tweets as actual U.S. policy.
Yeah, well, in effect, they are
Right.
if he gets his way, which is likely, given Congress. But what about voters? Do you think that that voters are following his tweets, or that he's just tweeting to a sort of a generic audience out there?
I think voters are following his tweets, but I'm not sure if it's following it in the best way possible. So, and what I mean by that is he definitely have his core supporters following him on Twitter, but we also know that there are plenty of people who follow his account and would retweet his messages that they seem as very negative or derisive against people. But if decades
So
of
they're retweeting these because they're opposed to Trump, and they're letting people know that he's said something foolish or whatever.
So,
right? Yeah.
on Twitter, right, you can like someone's message if you, for one reason or another,
Yeah.
but you can also retweet it. And if you, and what we found is that if you look at the number of likes a tweet receives and the number of times that that tweet was retweeted, there is a correlation, but it's not a very strongly positive correlation. So people who follows him on Twitter is definitely reacting to it in very distinct ways.
Interesting, and some for entertainment, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
Yeah. It's very interesting to get an insight into how scholars in political science look at these things and break them down. You're giving us insights that I'm sure many of us have never considered before. What about the Twitter organization itself? Do they, I know that they've been pressed to enforce rules that they have for everybody else on the president, and they've just decided not to do that. But recently, I think they attached a click that you could make called "Get the Facts." So if Trump said a couple incorrect things or questionable things about the coronavirus, and they added a "Get the Facts" link on there. What can you tell us about that?
And I think, social media companies like Twitter, they're in a very difficult position because on the one hand, they're very much interested, I would say, in making sure that the public receives correct information, especially on something as important as the coronavirus. But at the same time, there is an element to a political leader's what he or she says publicly that has importance that, whether or not it's truthful, right, there's an obligation almost, just like the media would, of reporting what occurred.
Yeah, yeah. And if the president says it right or wrong,
Right.
it's newsworthy. So where does this take democracy? You think about the movement through the Enlightenment and these small groups of people having influence on the king and the parliaments forming and the American experiment, right? And going through Roosevelt and Nixon and Trump on Twitter. What does this mean for the system here?
Well, not great, or
Yeah.
nothing good at least. So the cynical side, right, in me would say that this is simply a natural progression in how polarized that this country has become, right? If you think about how today it's very difficult to have a political conversation with someone you disagree with, to where and to where the influence of on the one hand, social media is great because it allows us to communicate. It allows presidents to communicate directly to the people without the media serving as the middle person.
Right.
But at the same time, what social media has also given us is this ability to have political silos of our own.
So it makes these political voices less accountable in a sense, right?
Right, and it encourages political leaders to appeal to the basis of our instincts rather than to promote any sort of democratic dialogue.
A parallel incident that comes to mind is during the Nixon presidency, Spiro Agnew gave a series of, I think, 4 speeches attacking the news media over a period of about a year. And in one of the speeches, he argued that when the president delivers a speech on TV, that the reporters should have to wait 24 hours before reporting on it so that they didn't skew the public's understanding of the president's message. And the news media was outraged by this, and they made fun of it, and they attacked it. But in a sense, you're saying that what Agnew wanted is come to fruition here, because the tweets go directly into people's pockets, essentially.
And Trump himself have acknowledged as such, right? He have had multiple conversations with journalists who ask, why are you tweeting so much, and why are you giving information that seem to many people should be kept private? Well, his reply is that he does not rely on the media, right? When someone attacks him, whether publicly or privately, he's able to respond right away, right? And he knows that when he says something, when he tweets something, the media will pick it up right away. There's no delay.
Yeah.
So if you think about his attempts to communicate, whatever those messages are, right? Regardless of we agree with them or not, he's able to do it very fast and have the power of social media, but also of traditional media as well.
Well, now, something that comes to mind here also is, what if Biden were to start tweeting like this spontaneously, right? And it seems to me that would be disastrous for Biden. So do you think so? And why is it that Trump fits so nicely into this? Why is this working so well for Trump, and it wouldn't work maybe so well for anyone else?
Well, I think part of the answer is his background of how media savvy he is. I think a traditional politician is always careful of what he or she says publicly, and to think about the image and the impact that those words may have on future elections.
Democrats in particular are very, very conscious of being politically correct at all times, and apologizing if they say anything that seems a little bit off. And Trump almost seems to be purposely defying that, right?
Right, and it's not that he doesn't care, right? He definitely cares about reaction, but if there's one thing that he seems to care more about, is that he always needs to be at the center of attention, and Twitter is his best approach to get that. Yeah.
Well, so where does this go next for you? You plan on following up on this with something else, or?
So this is a book project that took some time to complete.
Yeah.
But I am interested in this dynamic of presidents and the public, and how they use rhetoric to get the sort of the things that they want. So the next in the Trump Twitter is a group of PNW instructors, professors, and I. We're on a project where we examined the tone of Trump's Twitter messages and the impact that it may have on the economy. So there has been studies that show that tries to get at when, say, Trump tweets about Amazon, right? To what extent does that impact stock prices at Amazon and other companies that happens to be in one of those messages? And what we want to do is take a broader approach and to look at sort of more, if we step out beyond just individual companies or industries, to see what broad-based impact do those communications have or might have on the economy as a whole.
And as we get to the end here, I'm curious though, I mean, is there a history of presidents having said things that impacted the economy inadvertently? Is there?
Well, political scientists have long looked at the extent to which presidential rhetoric is tied to economic performance. So there is a very long and rich history of literature in this area. But I think one of the interesting question to me is, right, because of the sort of breakthrough that or the breakthrough in the breakthrough that social media and the impact that social media have, which differs from traditional media, right? If presidents now have this ability to go directly public, as we describe in the book, is the economy responding the same that it has before? Is the economic impact of what president says longer? Or is it that the advent of social media or multiple ways that we could get messages today, is it sort of filtering out and overriding what presidents might say?
Yes, almost is it the message of the media,
Right.
And we're back to Marshall McLuhan. Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Ouyang for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.